Well, hi there. My name is Andrew Gardner, and welcome to another episode of my Zoom lecture series. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. And I'm putting these lectures together, I suppose, partly as a result of the pandemic, but also teaching online and providing these lectures that are sometimes useful to some of my students or fit into some of the classes that I teach. And today, the lecture that I'm going to present is called Unpacking Cultural Appropriation, as you can see from the title slide here. And when I do these lectures, as I'm doing now, I like to start with a brief abstract that kind of describes some of the terrain that I'm going to be covering today in this lecture, which I expect typically will last about 45 minutes. So in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the concept of cultural appropriation. I'll start with a discussion of some of the examples of the public conflagrations that show how energetic and combative this perceived issue has grown to be in contemporary American culture. It seems to have been weaponized, I think, like many other concepts of that type. Then I want to think a little bit about some of the definitions for cultural appropriation that circulate in the public sphere. After that, we'll spend some time looking at 4 examples of culinary items and their movement throughout history and through space on the surface of our planet. These 4 cases, and I'm going to talk about fortune cookies, Carne Al Pastor, Kombucha, and Fajitas, those cases are going to give us some empirical material to think with about the topic of cultural appropriation. With all of that under our belt, I'll then walk us through some concluding thoughts that, at least in my mind, point to the conceptual incoherence of the concept of cultural appropriation. I wonder if you'll agree. We'll see. So I wanted to start again by pointing to the contemporary vitality of this concept in the public sphere and in American culture. And so several years ago, a Portland native and chef named Sally Krantz returned to her hometown of Portland, Oregon, after 2 decades abroad in Hong Kong and elsewhere, I imagine, to open this restaurant, which you see here, Saffron Colonial, a restaurant that sought to purvey English food from the British colonies. Several protests emerged in response to the image conveyed by the restaurant, and a handful of her vendors cut ties to the restaurant. In response, she changed the name of the restaurant to the British Overseas Restaurant Corporation, but to no avail. It subsequently closed. Interestingly, a few years earlier, and also in Portland, 2 young women, Callie Wilgus and Liz Conley, I'm sorry if I mispronounced either of those names, sought to join the booming culinary scene in Portland, Oregon, and opened a food cart. They were going to specialize in burritos and use a technique that they had gleaned from a recent trip to Mexico and built on the admiration of the tortillas that they encountered there. So this led to an explosion on social media, an explosion of attention, instigating something that still is referred to, and you can look on the internet, called #BurritoGate, and led to the subsequent closure of their business as well. So these 2 examples are 2 examples of many. But notably, they're examples that are confined to those brittle, white, wealthy urban epicenters on America's left coast, epicenters of American progressivism, as it's called today. And I'll put the air quotes around progressivism. But my Instagram feed is also regularly peppered with similar content, various individuals, and I must say, at least from what I see, typically young female, individuals, Americans, calling attention to the perceived appropriations they've noted and pleading with a vaguely conceived public audience to, quote, stop doing this or, quote, stop thinking that. That inquisitional tone of the quotidian fascism that we Americans seem to be growing accustomed to. Indeed, in the aftermath of these events, activists, and again, air quotes, began assembling a crowdsourced list of appropriative establishments in Portland. This act, this list, and to really the sign that you saw on one of the previous slides from Saffron Colonial, in my mind bears striking resemblance to the Nazis' partially successful nationwide boycott of Jewish enterprises in Germany, 1933, and the subsequent pressure to either close or sell those enterprises to Aryan nationalists. This was followed by, quote, smashed Jewish store windows, destroyed goods, and carried out massive looting. German officials calculated that 7,500 enterprises were damaged or destroyed in the rampages. So this started in 1930, in the early 30s in Germany, and then reached its crescendo on Kristallnacht in 1938. My goal here foremost is to paint paint cultural appropriation simply as an energetic contemporary issue in America, worthy of our interest and our analysis. But even in these initial examples, I think we can also see that food is an interesting way for us to explore and to unpack this issue. And that's the segue to the centerpiece of my lecture. So soon I'm going to turn to this historical journey through these 4 different foodstuffs. Again, I'm going to start with fortune cookies and spend a bit of time on fortune cookies. And I'll more quickly work my way through the story of carne asada, kombucha, and fajitas. But first, we need to think a little bit about the definitions of cultural appropriation that suffuse the American public sphere. So, I want to start with a basic definition, one that I gleaned from the internet. Easy enough to find these kinds of definitions, and I'll read this one out loud. Cultural misappropriation distinguishes itself from the neutrality of cultural exchange, appreciation, and appropriation because of the instance of colonialism and capitalism. Cultural misappropriation occurs when a cultural fixture of a marginalized culture or community is copied, mimicked, or recreated by the dominant culture against the will of the original community, and above all else, commodified. So this is a definition from Devin Springer from Medium, published in Medium, September 11th, 2018. And in my estimation, I would certainly take note of the conceptual acrobatics that this definition is up to. In short, this definition, and many others like it, attempts to assert some kind of clear and underlying logic to the concept of cultural appropriation, but inevitably falls back on the actors involved and the perceived underlying power dynamics of those relations. So this is familiar territory, I would say, to many of us. And as I'll argue, I think it's evidence of the concept's incoherence, emblematic of the post-truth era that's been gleefully forged on contemporary social media. But I'll also challenge the purported underlying logic of the power dynamics at work in this concept. And furthermore, where we'll end near the end of this presentation, I'll end up contending that cultural appropriation as a concept actually serves the interests of neoliberal capitalism and the vestiges of imperial power. But we'll get there. So moving on to my case studies. First, I want to start with the fortune cookies. And so by most accounts, fortune cookies Um, by most accounts, fortune cookies trace their ancestry to the conglomeration of bakeries gathered around a temple outside of Kyoto, Japan. So in Japan, there are a wide array of foods and desserts that contain messages and fortunes. And the Japanese American Makoto Hagiwara made and served fortune cookies from the 1890s onward in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. By the 1930s, there's some evidence that the Japanese American Hamano family in Los Angeles was producing and distributing fortune cookies to more than 100 Japanese-owned restaurants in Southern California. Interestingly, at that time, and up until World War II, the Japanese immigrant families, some Japanese immigrant families in California and elsewhere, owned and operated chop suey restaurants on the West Coast, serving an Americanized cuisine that was actually marketed as Chinese. So here you can already sort of get a whiff of cultural appropriation at work. But the story of the fortune cookie takes an even more dramatic turn shortly. So on December 7th, 1941, as some of you may know, the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval fleet in Pearl Harbor, killing 2,403 Americans and drawing the United States into the Second World War. Shortly thereafter, President Roosevelt on President Roosevelt's orders, 110,000 Japanese Americans in the United States mainland were forced into internment camps. An additional 22,000 Canadians of Japanese ancestry were also sent to internment camps in the Canadian interior. Additionally, keep in mind that Japan was also fighting China in this war. So there was a conflict between Japan and China that was a part of the war that ensued. So during the Japanese period of internment, the aforementioned chop suey restaurants, again, that were being operated by Japanese Americans at the time, but marketed as Chinese, as well as the bakeries making these fortune cookies, were commandeered by Chinese Americans. And so through this sequence of events, fortune cookies were bonded to Chinese food in American cuisine. And then as soldiers returned from the Pacific Theater in World War II, many of them coming through San Francisco and other ports of call on the West Coast, the fortune cookie was emblazoned in memories and understandings of what it meant to eat a Chinese meal. And then, therefore, via those soldiers, we can see sort of proliferated and disseminated throughout America as a new sort of cultural norm. So the social relations in this history that I've presented really manifest the power inequalities that are envisioned as resting at the core of most accusations concerning cultural appropriation. So, for example, the well-positioned Japanese Americans appropriated the Chinese culinary mantle with chop suey restaurants that proliferated before the war. Conversely, after the forcible internment of most Japanese Americans, Chinese American entrepreneurs appropriated their restaurants and bakeries and food traditions during a period when the Japanese American population was under unprecedented duress in America. As Derek Wong, the vice president of Wonton Food, the Brooklyn-based largest producer of fortune cookies in the world, noted, quote, "The Japanese may have invented the fortune cookie, but the Chinese people really explored the potential of the fortune cookie. It's Chinese-American culture. It only happens here, not in China." His sentiments, I think, really speak directly to the process of commodification that is typically envisioned at the core of the issue presented by cultural appropriation. All right, so that concludes my brief overview of the history of fortune cookies, but now I want to move on and talk next about Carne Al Pastor. So this mode of meat preparation, known as al pastor in Mexico, traces its roots to shawarma in the Middle East. And you can see that from these two pictures. Here we are with Mexico in a Mexican style of meat preparation. And next you can see Middle Eastern shawarma. And obviously they're quite similar. So certainly there was the Moorish conquest of Spain that lasted nearly 8 centuries. And so the Islamic footprint on Spanish culture and traditions is vast, indelible, right? Whether we're talking about cuisine, architecture, or language, the impact was significant. But the preparation of the meat in this Al Pastor style is actually traced more directly to the Lebanese migrants who arrived in Mexico in the 19th century. Tacos al pastor certainly resemble shawarma preparation, and in places like Puebla, these carne al pastor is even served on bread like pita. But these are more commonly seen as tracing directly to these Lebanese migrants in those regions. Now, the Lebanese, we can even back up in history and start to note that the Lebanese cuisine and the use of and preparation of meat in this style is thought to actually trace its roots to the Ottoman Empire. So Lebanon was part of the Ottoman Empire, colonized in a sense. And so when the Ottomans, the Turks, arrived, they brought all sorts of cuisine and practices with them as well. So here's a map in which I sort of attempt to sort of detail these movements. One of the most fascinating ironies in this is that now this style of meat preparation has traveled back yet again to Lebanon, where shawarma Mexican style is now served and is now a commodity. So I would say that clearly from this process we can sort of see the organic kind of cultural diffusion that characterizes all of human history. Processes, techniques, practices, ideas, and symbols travel with humans and with human migrations. As is the case with the preparation of meat, they're reappropriated and creatively configured and fitted into new contexts. The story of Carne Al Pastor involves colonizing empires, migrant newcomers, and a recurring historical landscape of inequality and difference. We might also, I think, pause briefly here to think back to the burrito truck that Callie Wilgus and Liz Connolly started, vilified by the Portland mob for purportedly appropriating aspects of a cuisine that was itself not indigenous in origin, but rather the end product of a millennium of empire, colonization, occupation, war, migration, and mobility. So next, I want to turn our attention to our third case study, which is going to be about kombucha. So kombucha is certainly familiar to most Americans today, but the beverage actually traces its roots back to ancient China, as many of you might know, many listeners might know. It was mentioned in literature from 220 BC as a, quote, remedy for immortality. The beverage was then subsequently appropriated, moved from China to what's now Korea, and then later appropriated or moved onward to Japan, where the Emperor of Japan in 1414 had his doctor, which I think was named Dr. Kombu, used it to help the emperor with digestive problems. The beverage also spread from China via trade routes, spread west, and became a popular folk medicine in Russia in the 1800s. During World War I, both Russian and German prisoners spread this folk remedy even further, and it made its way into European cuisines, and then subsequently into some of the colonies of North Africa as well, sometimes having different names in these different cultural traditions. So Interestingly, in most of the places of kombucha's former dominion, it's now been supplanted by industrial produced soft drinks, most of which are produced by transnational conglomerates. It remains somewhat common at the level of household production in some places, but its ascendance in America is more recent. Kombucha, as of 2016, was an industry estimated to be worth 1.606 billion US dollars. So, as a case study, I think that kombucha illustrates how difficult it is for us to attach a particular object, recipe, process, or culinary item to any particular geographical place. Like humans, ideas about food and its preparation have roamed the surface of the planet for millennia, and kombucha's history, again, is replete with inequalities, appropriations, both home and corporate production. All right, so lastly, we'll turn to the final food that I want to talk about, which are fajitas. So Tejano is the term that we use for Texan Mexican American subculture, so a kind of border subculture. And fajita is a Tejano term for little strips of meat cut from the beef skirt. The term fajita didn't appear in print until 1971, and only later did fajitas come to mean the dish as we know it today. Flour or corn tortillas, strips of beef skirt, and a variety of grilled vegetable additions, including things like peppers and onions and chilies and jalapenos. So as a food, fajitas were popularized in the 1990s, a process that commenced at the Hyatt Regency in Austin, Texas, and then rolled into Houston and San Antonio via some of their hotels as well. So the expansion of fajitas into American cuisine in the decade of the 1990s was predominantly due to the marketing efforts of various American fast food restaurants. The case of fajitas exemplifies the sort of culinary creativity that occurs in contact zones, I think, in interactions in the borderlands. This thesis on the value and the creativity that are fueled by intercultural trade and contact seems characteristic of many of the other examples that I've talked about as well. It is perhaps also of note that several years ago I received a term paper from a student that, in ethnographically exploring this concept of cultural authenticity, described another Puget Sound student of Mexican heritage and his consternation over the fact that some other students were in the dormitory kitchen preparing fajitas without sort of recognizing the heritage, the Mexican heritage of this tradition, oblivious to its heritage. While he was aware of the symbolic tether between fajitas and Mexico, he was unaware of the actual complexities of its creation. And so, to my mind, this really clarifies that the frictions around this notion of cultural appropriation really have little to do with empirical facts and historical accuracy. Rather, these foods come to symbolize culture. They serve as symbols of a kind of cultural purity that we Americans falsely imagine to exist. So, this brings me back to some definitions that I want to spend a little more time with before we move on to conclusions. So, these definitions are a little more precise and detailed as well. Law professor Susan Scafidi defined appropriation as follows, and I'll read this, even though I'm also going to put this up on your screen. Taking intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, or artifacts from someone else's culture without permission. This can include unauthorized use of another culture's dance, dress, music, language, folklore, cuisine, traditional medicine, religious symbols, etc. It's most likely to be harmful when the source community is a minority group that has been oppressed or exploited in other ways, or when the object of appropriation is particularly sensitive, for example, sacred objects. And then Nadra Karim Nidal adds, cultural appropriation typically involves members of a dominant group exploiting the culture of less privileged groups. Quite often, this is done along racial and ethnic lines with little understanding of the latter's history, experiences, or traditions. So first of all, I think we might focus on these first two, this notion of permission, right? And the implication here is that particular items belong to particular cultures, and there are clear groups of people who might authorize its use. Consider the impossibility of the application of this demand in the context of any of the cases I've described here. Who might authorize Sally Krantz to purvey cuisine inspired by colonial fusions? Who might want to ask for permission to make or sell fortune cookies? Might I receive permission from any Tejano American to start my fajita food cart? I think you can see my issue and challenge with this notion of permissions. But there's also these second issues, and where these definitions abandon impartiality and objectivity and move us into the realm where the resolution of 2 plus 3, or in this case, the presence of cultural appropriation, depends on the ethnic or racial identities of the parties involved, as well as the level of various indiscernible requirements, their understanding and their intentions, for example. Considering the 4 examples again, the Japanese Americans were marginalized by internment, leaving them prone to appropriation by Chinese Americans in this definition. How might we gauge power relations between the Chinese and Russians centuries ago? And how is privilege accounted for with Muslim conquest, Ottoman colonialism, and Lebanese Christians fleeing their homeland for Mexico? These are all further complications to the logic provided behind the concept of cultural appropriation. And so with that, I'd like to move on to my conclusions. And I'm going to do a little bit of careful reading here of some prepared comments. First, by paying attention to the currency and the application of the concept of cultural appropriation in America, I think it's apparent the concept is an incoherent tool in any of the scenarios that I've presented. Cultural appropriation is an incoherent concept in its popular use. Rather, I suggest that what masquerades as a concept pertaining to culture is more clearly, simply, a blunt weapon for contestations about race and inequality in America, and that the arguments generated by this concept obscure their fealty to capitalist relations, conceal it beneath a sheen of righteousness. Clearly, cultural appropriation is a concept used almost entirely to critique the European colonial past and aspects of the European and American present. So what about Chinese Americans commandeering fortune cookies, and Japanese Americans commandeering the mantle of Chinese food in Japanese American restaurants? Or Chinese Americans reappropriating chop suey restaurants when Japanese Americans were interned? What penitence is due to Christian Lebanese migrants who fled Islamic persecution in their homeland by migrating to Mexico, only to have a key feature of their culinary tradition itself appropriated from the Turks, slowly assimilated into Mexican culture, and now commodified and sold as shawarma Mexicans back in their homeland, or original homeland? Did 1 million Russian households appropriate kombucha from the Japanese emperors and Chinese traders? I suggest all of these cases reveal a conceptual morass at the foundations of cultural appropriation. The concept has no saliency in these scenarios. It dissipates in these other power-laden contexts. Secondly, I want to contend that creativity and exchange is what happens in borderland spaces. So, the consternation and socio-political gravity around the concept of cultural appropriation eclipses the fact that in the examples described in this lecture and the many additional examples not included here, all of those examples are evidence of the energy and the creative vitality that's generated in contact zones and interstitial spaces where cultures interact. Borderland Tejano culture yields culinary creations. Asian American migrants bend their culinary tradition to the American palate, and commandeering each other's creations produce altogether new sorts of culinary offerings. Ottoman foods are adopted and improved by the Lebanese. Those foods become Mexican versions of Al Pastor, then travel back along the same routes to Lebanon, where they're readopted in these original homelands. Culture diffuses. We learn from one another, and there's energy in the interstices. Indeed, cultural anthropology has a variety of terms to describe these processes and concepts. Syncretism, diffusion, hybridity, auto-orientalism, and lots more. These are all attentive to the kind of wonderful magic and the energetic nature of culture and contact. And fajitas are just one example of the things that came from that energy. So, like so many other aspects of contemporary society, I suggest, the frictions conjured around cultural appropriation merely reflect an identity politics that continues to avert our attention from the underlying landscape of inequality and the forces that generate it. Which brings me to my last point. That cultural appropriation as a concept fuels capitalist hegemony. It serves the interests of capitalism. So, as an anthropologist with a fairly cosmopolitan footprint in life, I'd love to simply conclude that cultural appropriation and all of its consternation, and all of the consternation that surrounds it, this is just another example drawn from the seemingly bottomless well of American bullshit. Yet another ethnocentricity that we might endeavor to minimize. But I think consigning it to the bin of bullshit doesn't do justice to some of the serious issues that are afoot here. The language and the idea of cultural appropriation capitulates to a deeply American framing of human interactions, grounded in capitalist notions of private property and ownership. Ensconced in the righteous rhetoric of social justice, cultural appropriation extends ideas of property, ownership, and exploitation to the cultural realm. Capitalism has long struggled to commodify culture, but accusations of cultural appropriation tether cultural exchange and interactions with difference to a capitalist logic. In short, the discourse of cultural appropriation mobilizes populist forces to help make the cultural realm more legible to neoliberal capitalism. It turns purportedly progressive American social justice warriors into the shock troops of neoliberal capitalism and blinds us all to the truly radical alternatives here. Free, open source exchange, sharing, and collaboration. But don't take my word for it. Let's have a look at what Kwame Appiah says in his recent book, and I'll put his words up here. Those who parse these transgressions in terms of ownership have accepted the commercial system that's alien to the traditions they aim to protect. The vigorous lobbying of huge corporations has made the idea of intellectual property go imperial. It seems to have conquered the world. To accept the notion of cultural appropriation is to buy into the regime they favor, where corporate entities, acting as cultural guardians, own a treasury of intellectual property, extracting a toll when they allow others to make use of it. And so, based on those words, I'll put up again this sign that someone affixed in the window of Saffron Colonial, and I will close with those sentiments. My perspectives on cultural appropriation as a vivacious concept in contemporary America and a sort of weaponized concept in the culture wars that America is currently enduring. I welcome any feedback or comments that you may have, and thanks for making it to the end.